I mentioned the book at the beginning, Neoliberalism and Race. Let's start with the term neoliberalism. Most people have heard of this term, but they couldn't really define it. Can we start by trying to define that term in your own words?
Sure, yeah, that's a good question and a great place to start. It's the title of the book and it's the topic of most of my academic research. You're right that it's a term that a lot of people will have heard, but might not necessarily be able to define immediately. If you walk up to someone in the street and you ask them, what's socialism, they probably have some kind of coherent answer. But if you ask them, hey, what's neoliberalism, they might sort of either look at you confusedly, or they might have some kind of answer that would not necessarily come very close to what my answer would be. So there's a lot of confusion surrounding the term. I think that is to do partly with a long history of imprecise use in the print media, in television media, but also in scholarly debate and academic debate, which is the main area that I sort of speak to. I think there's a few ways in which it's been used imprecisely. One is that it has a long history of being used as a kind of catch-all critical term, a sort of swear word that people, mostly on the progressive left, would use to describe things they don't like. They might say, this thing that I don't like at my job, it's all very neoliberal, or my boss is being very neoliberal, or the government did a very neoliberal thing. And I think that's legitimate. I think that's understandable. People do need language in order to be able to describe things they don't like. But it has rubbed off on that term a little bit. And it's made a lot of people sort of wary of that term as being imprecise. When it does get used with a bit more focus, a bit more narrowly, it tends to be used as a label for a particular period of political history. So you would ordinarily expect it to refer to the period of political history that starts in the UK with the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, in the United States with the election of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980, and sort of all over, certainly the capitalist world during this period, similar leaders and parties and governments were elected that had similar agendas. And these were quite aggressively free market governments with a conservative cultural agenda most of the time. And that sort of set off a period of political history that we really kind of still are in to an extent. There's debate over the extent to which we're still in this period, but it's a period of a lot of privatization of the state. The capitalist kind of system was really strongly enforced. And the welfare state that was built up after the Second World War got, shrunk and got eroded and was kind of replaced with a more, like I say, a more sort of muscular capitalist system. Again, I think there's truth to this. So that's a pretty accurate historical description of the period of political history that we've lived through in the past few decades. But I still think that as a definition of the term neoliberalism, it's not very adequate. Not only does it not give you helpful tools to think about how and using which means and according to which steps and at which historical moment neoliberalism became influential in different parts of the world. To give one clear example, in the country Chile, there was a military coup in the early 1970s, and the dictator who came into power, whose name was Pinochet, implemented a lot of neoliberal policies many years before Thatcher and Reagan were even elected. So if you want to speak of neoliberalism in Chile or in Latin America more broadly, you have to adjust the kind of dates and time period that you're thinking of. And the same is true for a lot of post-colonial contexts across Africa and Southeast Asia, for example. So once you start to prod that definition, it already starts to become a little bit less helpful. And another issue with thinking of it as a sort of period of political history is that it immediately asks the question or prompts the question, when did it end? A period has to have a start and an end. So that kind of gets you into the trap of asking yourself, okay, are we still in the period of neoliberal history? I find that unhelpful because it presents it as a thing that could either be still in force or no longer in force, alive or dead. And I don't think that's how political history works. I think political history works in sort of moments of overlap, and there are periods in which there's momentous change, but also, a lot of remnants from past political settlements continue into the present. So for all of these reasons, my preference academically, but also politically, is to think of neoliberalism as a historical phenomenon that is primarily an intellectual agenda. So I think of it as a set of ideas, essentially. For me, it's an intellectual history. Um, if you want to think of it in slightly more explicitly Marxist terms, you could call it an ideology, which is a term that I am fairly happy to use. But basically, that means that it's a history of ideas, arguments, concepts, and also of the people who formulated those ideas and were very important to the process of bringing them into being and spreading them, and then having them become policy, enacted as policy. Once you define it as that set of ideas, you end up with a set of tools to historically research them and to figure out where those ideas came from, who developed them, when, and in conversation with what. And then you can begin to sort of research how they actually became influential and via which paths um, and via which institutions and which routes. So that gives you a sort of quite narrow and concrete way of studying this thing that we call neoliberalism.
And I think what you just mentioned there is what I'm really fascinated by is the study of like how it came to be, but the people that are involved, how the ideas has changed, you mentioned the history of ideas and political history. I think like those are kind of intertwined, especially when it comes to
Yeah.
this term. And what I want to do here in this conversation is to kind of take people through those institutions and the peoples and the thinkers, especially because I feel like this idea is kind of prevalent in our culture and in our education and in how we see the world, but they're not understood of how they came to be. So
Mhm.
before we get into that in your book, which I think is a fantastic kind of way of bringing those concepts and explaining that for the wider audience, let's talk about why this idea is important currently. You mentioned post-colonialism and capitalism, but what are some of the reasons this idea has become so important currently in our current kind of ecosystem?
I think the answer to that is probably as simple as the ideas that, in my opinion, the term neoliberalism refers to became very influential. They essentially were the philosophical foundation for a whole range of governments and leaders and political parties to do the things that they did. So again, a clear example is Thatcher. Another clear example is Reagan. A third clear example is Pinochet. But there's relatively widespread understanding, certainly in academic circles, but I think also beyond that, that these governments and leaders took very clear and direct inspiration from a set of thinkers and from a set of writers and books and the think tanks that sort of were part of this broader network that formulated these ideas in doing the things that they did. It goes much further than just those individual leaders and individual countries, however, and I do think that's important to stress. Um, you can fall into the trap of thinking, oh, it was just Thatcher who was inspired by some of these thinkers, and so when Thatcher, left office, that direct connection was lost. But that is not really how ideas work. That's not how ideas become influential. They can become influential through individual people, but there's also a sort of set of systems and structures in place that they come to inform or perhaps even infuse, if you like. And those structures can sort of even operate at the level of a whole culture. So you can imagine that at some point, some of these ideas and beliefs and attitudes, even if they are kind of stripped down to simple messaging or simple rhetoric, come to be present in popular culture. You see them represented in the TV shows that we watch and the films that we watch and the novels that we read and the newspapers that we read and social media and all the rest of it. The kind of broader cultural field comes to be informed by these ideas. And then there's also an elite level that goes beyond individual governments. In my research, the most important sort of supranational institution that I have looked at is the World Bank, which was established in 1947 during what is known as the Bretton Woods agreements, alongside the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and these are sort of two really important supranational institutions that are essentially tasked with minding the stability of the global kind of economic system. In the 1980s, the World Bank in particular, but both the World Bank and the IMF, became very central to managing a global economic crisis that was particularly intensely felt in former colonial societies across Africa, but also across South America, for example. And the way that the World Bank dealt with that was to very aggressively force indebted countries, which mostly were indebted because of the history of colonialism, to adopt policies without which they would not give them loans. These are called structural adjustment programs. The point that I'm trying to get at is that a lot of the conditions that were attached to these loans were informed by the very same ideas that were also influential in the Thatcher and Reagan administration. So what I'm trying to say is that it wasn't just the case that in this country, at this point in time, this leader was informed by these ideas, but these ideas also traveled sort of internationally and became influential in, for example, the World Bank, and that is how they came to be implemented in countries where, however unpopular Margaret Thatcher was, she was democratically elected, and the ideas that she implemented had some kind of democratic legitimacy in that sense. This is not true for World Bank enforced policy changes. So you can see how these ideas sort of travel in different ways and at different speeds in various contexts across the world. To get back to your question, I think this is why it's important to continue to study this topic, because it's a kind of moment in history, these sort of 80s and 90s shifts and changes that created a system that we are still living in, and that has really given us the structures that still define very much of our lives, and establish the relationships between countries in the world and how the global kind of capitalist system operates.
I think before we get in depth into that, I want to take a little step back and kind of understand how you became involved with these ideas. What were some of the thinkers? What was the beginning of your kind of introduction to neoliberalism?
That's a great question.